this is where people are wrong, is it's not Day After Tomorrow. If you've seen the film Day After Tomorrow, I actually enjoy the film, but it's horribly inaccurate. Alrighty, COP26. Aptly named, it's actually the Conference of Parties, is what the acronym stands for, and it's the 26th Conference of Parties. Here, if I remember right here, but that's going on, and otherwise known in the media, and here in the top line, as you can tell, the UN Climate Change Conference, the UK 2021, being hosted in Glasgow. It is where President Biden is now, along with a bunch of other folks, all meeting on this related thing. And I figured since it's in the news and you're probably hearing about different things from the news media and what have you, I might as well give you my take on it, since this is where at least on the science side of things, this conference is a lot more about policy than it is about science. But, of course, science intersects with policy in many places. So, let's see here. Let me go into the introduction. Okay. COP26 explained, around the world, storms, floods, and wildfires are intensifying. Air pollution sadly affects the health of millions of people, and unpredictable weather causes untold damage to homes and livelihoods too. But while the impacts of climate change are devastating, and advances in tackling it are leading to cleaner air, creating good jobs, restoring nature, and at the same time unleashing economic growth. Despite these opportunities, we're not acting fast enough to grip this crisis. Countries need to join forces urgently. They also need to step up efforts to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate and make finance flows consistent with the pathway towards lower greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development. By completing and implementing the Paris Agreement at Glasgow, we can show the world that we're able to work together to take this crucial challenge, and by uniting behind a green recovery from the coronavirus, which creates sustainable jobs and addresses the urgent and linked challenges of public health, climate change, and biodiversity loss, we can safeguard the environment for future generations. So here's principal partners, Microsoft. Hey, GlaxoSmithKline. Here we go. Here, and Hitachi. Interesting. So let's see. What is a COP? Just to help people understand it. In November, the UK, what is a COP? And they didn't actually put the name in here. Together with our partners in Italy, we will host the event many believe to be the world's last best chance to get runaway climate change under control. COP26 is the 2020 United Nations Climate Change Conference. For nearly 3 decades, the UN has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for global climate summits called COPs, which stands for Conference of the Parties. In that time, climate change has gone from a fringe issue to a global priority. This year will be the 26th annual summit, giving it the name COP26, with the UK as president. COP26 takes place in Glasgow, so basically one country gets to run the show every year. That's what happens with that. In the run-up to COP26, the UK is working with every nation to reach an agreement on how to tackle climate change. World leaders will arrive in Scotland alongside tens of thousands of negotiators, government representatives, businesses, and citizens for 12 days of talks. Understand that most of the time this is not scientists in this meeting. Understand that. A lot of science that gets thrown to them, but most of the time this is not scientists. Not only a huge task, but it is also not just yet another international summit. Most experts believe COP26 has a unique urgency. To understand why, it's necessary to look back to another COP. COP21 took place in Paris in 2015. That was when the Paris Agreement was signed. For the first time ever, something momentous happened. Every country agreed to work together to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate and make money available to deliver these aims. The Paris Agreement was born. The commitment to aim for 1.5 degrees became important because every fraction of a degree warming will result in the loss of many more lives and wait a friggin'. Because every fraction of a degree of warming will result in the loss of many more lives lost and livelihoods damaged. Horrible grammatically. There's so much wrong in that sentence. Anyway, under the Paris Agreement, countries committed to bringing forward national plans setting out how much they will reduce their emissions, known as Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. They agreed that every 5 years they would come back with an updated plan that would reflect their highest possible ambition at the time. Well, We're on 6 years. They probably meant to have it last year, and they didn't because of the pandemic. The run-up to this year's Glasgow summit in Glasgow is the moment, delayed by a year due to the pandemic, called that right, when countries update their plans for reducing emissions. But that's not all. The commitments laid out in Paris did not come close to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. The window for achieving this is closing. The decade out to 2030 will be crucial. So you see they embrace the 12 years thing that AOC kind of put out there. Because even the IPCC report said, no, it's that window of making it irreversible is somewhere between 2030 and 2052. 2030 is the earliest. Somebody embraced 2030. So as momentous as Paris was, countries must go much further than they did. I can't talk today. Even at the historic summit, in order to keep the hopes of holding temperature rises to 1.5 degrees alive. And when they're talking about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or what have you, they are talking about the increase over pre-industrial times here of the global average temperature. They are not talking about local temperature where you are. They are talking about the global average temperature. And so at the threshold of 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees Celsius, that is when they believe that there will be irreversible damage to ecosystems and what have you, and to people's ways of life. And in other words, it'd be unrecoverable, and a lot of things are going to have to change. There will be a lot of impacts, a lot of suffering, and what have you. That is what the idea is, and why they focus on 2 degrees. COP16 is the 16th United Nations Climate Change Conference of Youth, organized in collaboration with YouNGO, the official youth constituency of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is one of the largest entirely youth-led global youth climate conferences in the world. The conference takes place from the 28th to the 31st of October, days before the annual UN Climate Change Conference, also known as the Conference of Parties, in the same host country as the COP. COI serves as a space for capacity building and policy training in order to prepare young people for the participation at COP and their life as local and international climate advocates. The conference is organized by 7 working groups and coordinators in 152 countries, whose main objective is to gather the local youth statements and raise the voices of global youth to the United Nations decision-making process. International climate summits are complex. Here at UK COP26 team, we want to make it as easy possible for you to understand what COP26 is, and the UK team is working to achieve. There are a few helpful resources to get you started. So there is a lot that goes on, but as I said, this particular conference is not about the science itself. It is about the negotiations and the politicking that's involved, and probably what's going on behind the scenes before and after that you don't get to see. So those kind of things. And this is probably a good thing to go here of what they're looking to do. What do we need to achieve? Secure global net zero by mid-century, and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. Countries are being asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emissions reductions that align with the target of reaching net zero by the middle of the century. To deliver these targets, countries will need to accelerate the phase-out of coal, curtail deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles, encourage investment in renewables. You notice nothing about nuclear there? See, the reason this is coming from me personally, the reason I don't like renewables, like wind and solar, is because at the moment they take up a tremendous amount of land. They take up a tremendous amount of land, which means you have to be cutting down trees, or you have to be removing things from their habitat, or you have to be doing XYZ number of things. So it doesn't work very well from the standpoint, actually, of being very environmentally friendly to me. It takes a lot of land to get the same amount of energy that you can get with a nuclear power plant. And so that's, again, this is why this is not helpful. And at least from, with the electric vehicles, what you're really spending, yes, they don't burn gas. They get the charge from wherever you plug it in. But you still have whatever's being burnt there. So you have to talk about whatever is connected to the power grid and things like that. But you also have to figure out, how much of the fossil fuels is going into making these things. And the fact that the electric vehicle batteries are not very recyclable yet, at last I checked. Things like that. Adapt to protect. Not that I'm not saying we shouldn't go be using less fossil fuels or things like that, because I do think we need to get there eventually. But I'm just pointing out these are not necessarily entirely good things. Adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. Climate is already changing, and it will continue to change even as we reduce emissions with devastating effects. COP26, we need to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to protect and restore ecosystems, build defenses, warning systems, and resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of homes, lives, livelihoods, and even lives. Mobilize finance to deliver on our first two goals. Developed countries must make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance per year by 2020. International financial institutions must play their part, and we need to work toward unleashing trillions in private and public sector finance required to secure global net zero. Work together to deliver. We can only rise to the challenges of the climate crisis by working together. At COP26, we must finalize the Paris Rulebook, the detailed rules that make the Paris Agreement operational, accelerate action to tackle the climate crisis through collaboration between governments, businesses, and civil society. So a lot of these are extremely vague. Extremely vague in here. And that's in part because you're dealing with international negotiations, and I also think that's in part because I don't think they necessarily want you to know. So let's see. So some other things I think probably would be good and useful here, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but I do encourage you to go read it here. And hold on a second. An inclusive COP26. Oh, okay. I'll let you go read that. I thought it might have been a little bit social justice-y, but it doesn't seem to be quite that, as much as they're talking about vaccination and what have you in here. So that's different. But I encourage you to go read this thing here. It's certainly interesting if you want a little bit more of what they say they're trying to do, rather than hearing it from the news media, be it Fox or CNN or MSNBC or any number here. But this actually I saw in Science, and I figured it would, Scientific American rather, and I figured it would also be something useful here. Comes to Scientific American from The Conversation. A quick guide to climate change jargon ahead of COP26, because there's an awful lot of jargon that's going to go flying around. And so this I found to be decent. I found this to be decent, and they are quite right that a lot of the climate stuff is a lot of the climate stuff and the technical stuff is written at a very scientific and technical level, and most people don't know what the hell it is. So in here, we're going to get into some of the definitions here that are in the Scientific American article. Of course, this will be linked in the description. Go have fun to read it. IPCC definition of mitigation. Mitigation is a human intervention to reduce emissions or enhance sinks of greenhouse gases, which is, no, it's not stopping climate change from getting worse. It is literally what IPCC says it is, which is the idea of policies that reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases or help to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. That's the point with that one. Mitigation does often refer to fossil fuels, as they get into here. Not entirely, not always that. Solar and wind. Nuclear. Don't forget nuclear, because nuclear, I think, is actually going to be a lot more helpful than solar and wind. Making buildings and appliances more energy efficient, all this kind of stuff. Adaptation. Here is another one you'll hear flung around. In a human systems, the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate or its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. In natural systems, the process of adjustment to actual climate and its effects, human intervention may facilitate to adjustment to expected climate and its effects. So in other words, resilience, improving resilience, adapting to what's going on around you and things like that. And this is not necessarily an abnormal thing. This is actually, if you're talking about adapting and making your society a bit more resilient to natural disasters, severe weather events, that's actually, that's the biggest part of what adaptation is, really, is just that, just in a general sense. When you're talking about it with respect to climate change, I mean, the idea might be, okay, build the seawall a bit higher, build your infrastructure a bit stronger, think about how building codes may have to change and things like that to go with it. Carbon dioxide removal. Carbon dioxide removal methods refer to processes that remove CO2 from the atmosphere either increasing biological sinks of CO2 or using chemical processes to directly bind CO2. CDR, carbon dioxide removal, is classified as a special type of mitigation. Yes. So that's what they're talking about. Generally, if you just hear mitigation, that's what they're talking about, emissions reductions. They don't often mean this at the same time. Mitigation is often used just to mean emissions reductions. Here, carbon dioxide removal is special. That's when you talk about carbon capture and storage and yanking it back out of the atmosphere in some way or another. And that also that often has to do with trees and grasslands and what have you, because they are very effective at doing that. Carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality is achieved when anthropogenic CO2 emissions are balanced globally by anthropogenic carbon dioxide removals over a specific period. Carbon neutrality is referred to as net zero carbon dioxide emission. This is something that people get wrong. The idea when we say net zero, that, and I'm going to harp on this with the conservatives because they do this, is the idea that we're going to stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere. We're going to stop doing that or stop doing that. That's not what's actually meant by net zero. By net zero, what's meant is that for everything you put into the atmosphere, you find some way to take it back out again. So you have a balance between the two of them. It doesn't mean shut down all fossil fuels or anything like that. Although that is actually what a lot of climate scientists would prefer, is that there is no more fossil fuels burned anywhere. But that's not what carbon neutral itself means, and that is not what the net zero carbon dioxide emission means. It means that you are not putting anything that you put into the atmosphere, you're taking back out. So figuring out some way to do that. And that is a fair thing. I think we can, that is potentially very achievable. I don't think the way human society has evolved and the leapfrogging thing from older energy sources to renewables hasn't worked. So you're going to need fossil fuels for a time, at least, until you get to whatever the next new energy source is, because I don't think renewables are going to work long term either. And so there's things like that is a good thing to think about with carbon neutrality, which is what we mean. What we mean is for everything you put into the atmosphere, how do you figure out how to take it back out again? Tipping point, a level of change in system properties beyond which a system reorganizes often abruptly and does not return to its initial state, even if the drivers of the change are abated. For the system, it refers to the critical threshold when global or regional climate changes from one stable state to another stable state. That one is fairly straightforward here, surprisingly, in that what they're talking about is the idea that you will hit a point, and this is where people are wrong, is it's not day after tomorrow. If you've seen the film Day After Tomorrow, I actually enjoy the film, but it's horribly inaccurate. That is not how the climate is going to change. It doesn't change. It doesn't happen abruptly over a period of weeks, okay? The way it did in that film. That's not what they're talking about with this. It does take a fair bit of time, but you are talking about transitioning from one state to another where there is a certain amount of upheaval in the climate system, and that has happened naturally before. What they're talking about at this time is having it happen as a result of human action instead of having it happen naturally in this particular instance. So that's your point there with that. Unprecedented transition. The definition for transition, process of changing from one state to another or condition to another in a given period of time. Transition can be individuals. So what they're talking about with this most of the time in the policy side of things is transitioning economically, transitioning away from fossil fuels, those kinds of things. That's a pretty important thing there. Sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, and balances social, economic, and environmental concerns. So I'm not reading their translation because I don't necessarily agree with Scientific American's translations on these things. Whether or not you agree, go for it on that one. But that is the idea of sustainable development. Effectively, is the idea of making sure you're not overusing all those kinds of good things, making sure you're living in a way that is sustainable in the long term for yourself and others in here. And of course, this is not necessarily thinking about it on an individual perspective in the way they think with this. This is societal level is what we're talking about. Abrupt change. Abrupt change refers to a large-scale change in the climate system that takes place over a few decades or less, persists or is anticipated to persist for at least a few decades and cause substantial disruptions in human and natural systems. So when they're talking about that tipping point thing, tipping point leads you to abrupt change in their kind of thing here. And that most of the time in a natural change cycle, it does take several decades at least to hundreds of years to be able to go through it. And what they're talking about is the potential that it could change over a few decades or less. But it would still be longer than the period in the Day After Tomorrow. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about with respect to COP26 going on right now. With all that in mind, I hope you liked the video. I hope you comment on the video. I hope you share the video. And then that's the video there. Comment below, subscribe to the channel, head over to Locals and join us if you'd like to talk more about this topic and others. And I may go more into this in Thursday Thoughts. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do for Thursday Thoughts this week. But until next time, I hope you check out all these links. And I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious.